We're starting a new series called In God We Trust. In God We Trust. And so we're going to take the next 3 weeks and reflect on how God uses money to shape our spiritual life. We're going to talk about how God uses money to shape our spiritual life. And what you'll find is your spiritual life is being shaped by money all the time. And what we want to do is talk about it in a way that is healthy, that is biblical, and that brings us joy. Usually for most folks, money and joy don't go together. But by the end of this, I'm hoping that we've made a dent in the right direction. So the scripture text today you'll find on the screen, and I invite you to read along silently with me. It says this: Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me to be a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, drink and be merry, and watch Netflix and chill." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then you will get what you've prepared for yourself. And this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." You know, it's fun to talk about harvest, but then the next question that's logical is, well, what do you do with it? What do you do with a harvest, and how are we supposed to respond to that? So we're going to talk about that for just a few minutes, but before I do, I want to just tell you a little bit about this really fascinating story. Jesus was in a big group of people. And we don't know all the details, but he's with all this crowd, and someone kind of like butts their way in, and right in the middle of while Jesus is kind of teaching people stuff, he goes, "Teacher, I need some help. My brother isn't sharing the inheritance with me, and I need you to sort it out." And this wasn't an uncommon practice at that time, because he calls him teacher, which means rabbi, and in those days, that was the person you would often go to sort out these issues. I'm really thankful that, 2,000 years later, no one comes to me for these kinds of things. But in Jesus' day, there was really no division between your spiritual teachers and your practical teachers. It actually, this is a side note, but it really wasn't until the 18th, 19th centuries or so, when we even started to divide up theology, law, medicine. Back in the old days, it was all one thing, and that recognizes the great unity of the world. And so what happened was they went to Jesus with a money question, and he said, "I need you to tell my brother to fix things." And even though people don't normally come to me with these things, do you think folks have asked me before, "Hey, what do I do about money stuff?" It happens all the time. And we'll talk about why in just a minute. But someone came to Jesus and they said, "I need him to give me my fair share." And what does Jesus do in response? Does he solve the guy's problem? No, Jesus is miserable. Because if you ever came to him with a question, he would answer you with another question and take it in a totally different direction. That's his style. And so what he did is he takes this guy and he says, hey, one, I didn't come here to just come around deciding things about money. My purpose is higher. And I'm not that kind of judge. I'm actually going to judge the whole world, and I'm going to die on a cross for everyone's sins. And so I didn't come here to be bothered by this stuff, but, and this is what he does, he finds the issue beneath the issue. He finds the issue that's underneath the question. And what was the issue underneath the question? "I want my stuff, Jesus. This guy stole it from me, and I feel like I deserve something." And then the issue underneath that issue is what? Because I believe that if I don't get my money, I'm not okay. So, there's always the things underneath the things underneath the things, and there's layers just like onions in people's hearts. And Jesus sees what's going on beneath the surface. And he says, we're not really talking about an inheritance issue here, are we? What we're really talking about is, why do you think you need this money so badly? And why do you think I am the one who's going to come in and fix this for you? And he says, let me tell you a parable. And a parable is always tricky because you have to wrestle really hard with it. It doesn't have a super clear meaning sometimes. You have to dig deep to understand what's going on. And this is the parable that he tells them. He says that there was a guy who his land yielded a lot of harvest. And of course, we live in a day and an age where we don't often connect land to money, but in those days it was almost the same thing. And so this man had a field and a farm that generated all this food, which then generated all kinds of revenue. And he found himself in a place one day where he had too much stuff. Too much stuff. And his next question was not, how do I give it away? His next question wasn't, how do I make sure I use this well? His next thought was what? I got to build a more 4-car garage to put all my stuff. I'm going to build bigger barns, that's what the text says. What I just need is have you ever noticed that one of the fastest growing businesses over the last 20 years is storage facilities? We live in a culture that is not very different from this, trust me. And so what happens is this guy thinks to himself, I've got a lot of stuff, I've got a lot of things, and things keep coming my way, and the solution is going to be build more space to put it. Build more space to put it. And so he thinks to himself, and this is what the text says, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns, and I'll build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain, and I'll say to myself, I love this line, you have plenty of grain laid up for years. Your 401k is funded. I've got everything settled well. I've got health insurance taken care of. I've got all this okay. What I need to do is do this. Take life easy. Drink and be merry. I'm going to live a life defined by Viking cruises. I'm going to live a life defined by financial security and good planning. And again, we're going to talk about how complicated this is in a minute because I don't want to simplify it in a bad way. But this guy thinks to himself, all right, I've got all this stuff. I need more space to store it. And the goal of my life is what? It's to get it all put into all these barns so that it's like a fortress around me, protecting me from all the stress of the world. And then once I get everything set up all around me so that all of the stress is gone, then I can do what's truly on my heart, which is rest, drink, be merry. In other ways to say it is just have a good time, chill out, buy a vineyard in Napa, and just do what I want to do. And some of you are thinking to yourself, I've never thought that, Pastor Chris. I would never want to just do that. But I'll be honest with you, I'm that person then. I often think to myself, oh man, if I could just get to retirement, then I won't have any more session meetings. If I could just reach this point where I've built up enough stuff, then I can finally be at peace. And that's often how we think about life. You grind and you grind and you grind. Why? So that you can just be happy and rest at the end. And did you know that if you approach life like that, not only are you not going to find abundant life in the process, but then what might happen to you is what happens to this man, and this is what the text says. But God says to him, you fool. Man, I just want to pause. It's a crazy thought to think that God calls some people fools. There's been times in my life where I know God looks down and says, Chris, I love you, but you're being a fool, man. And he looks down at this man that had saved up all this stuff and had this big plan for his life and had saved up everything in order that he could rest. And then God says, you fool, this very night from you, your life will be demanded. Then who will get what you've prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. This is a challenging text, But what I want to do this morning is just talk about 4 things as it relates to this story. And the first one you'll see on the screen, it says this. Jesus talked a lot about money. Jesus talked a lot about money. It's very difficult for me as a pastor sometimes, and you'll see this first bullet point on the screen. We got it. Jesus talked a lot about money. We got it. I'll be honest, as a pastor, I grew up in the church that I read the news, and I know that churches that talk about money a lot often are churches where their pastors are driving like jets. Do you know what I'm talking about on TV? And I'm not trying to be judgmental, but I also know that churches and money are very complicated. They just can be. My dad was the treasurer of a church once, a little Presbyterian church, and he was on session, did all that thing, and discovered that someone within the church had been stealing money. And they had to go through this whole long process. And I remember just what a toll it took on his faith and how messy all that got. And I remember thinking to myself as a young kid, man, I don't ever want to be a part of a church. And of course, you read more stories and you read more, and what you find out is that churches and money can often be really complicated. And so that's one of the reasons why I often shy away from it. Another reason, though, is even more practical than that, is on a given Sunday, there's folks within our congregation, there's folks that are listening online who have been here every single day for like 50 years, and they're like, we are faithful givers, we don't need to hear messages on that. But at the other side of the spectrum, there are people that are in our congregation today probably for the very first time. And so one of the reasons why I'm often shy to talk about money is because if you're here for the first time, you're going to think to yourself, man, all this church does is talk about money. Right? And so what that means is I often never talk about it because I never want to be that pastor. And I don't want to be that church, because if you're showing up here for the first time, you're probably thinking to yourself, man, if only I'd come last week. But one of the reasons why I am getting more comfortable with it in time is because I realize Jesus talked a lot about it. Jesus talked a lot about money. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, where this text is from, you could argue that he talks more about how we use our resources, our time, our talents, and other things than almost anything else. And that's a surprise. We think that Jesus wants to talk about love and salvation and forgiveness of sins, and all that is there, but money is like right alongside it in almost every story. And so if I want to honor the biblical text, if I want to be faithful to what Jesus says, then I don't have a choice as a pastor at the end of the day. To give you a sense, these are some of the things that he says. He says, give to the one who asks, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Jesus says, when you give to the needy, don't announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues. Truly, I tell you, they've received their reward. He tells us this, don't worry about your life and what you will eat or drink, or about your body or what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? If you want to be perfect, he says, go sell all your possessions and give to the poor, and then you'll have treasure in heaven. Jesus says no one can serve two masters. Either you'll hate the one and love the other, but you cannot serve both God and money. And there's 20 more, but I'll save it. Jesus talked about this stuff all the time. And so in order to be faithful, wholehearted Jesus followers, we should talk about it too. But here's the main reason why I think it's really important, why Jesus talked about it a lot. I did this at a church in Miami, and it was super risky, and I don't regret it, but I'm not ready to do it here. What I did is I took my bank statement from the last month, and I just made it public, like my credit card statement, all the details. And I said, if you look through all my spending, what you're going to find isn't what I bought. What you're going to find, if I printed out all the details of my bank account and whatever all my cards were, and I printed them out and I put them all on a sheet and I gave it to you, what you wouldn't see is money. What would you see? You'd find what I care about, what I value, where I spend my time and where my energy, and you'd be like, man, this guy loves Chipotle. He absolutely loves Chipotle and Apple and a bunch of other crazy things. And so what you'd find when you print out your statements is what you really find isn't money, you find your heart. Jesus says where your money is, there your heart is also. And Jesus is always interested in our hearts. He's not interested in money. And it's funny how close they go together, and that's why it's important to talk about. And so one of the things that we say over and over here, and I'll continue to say, is Jesus, when we talk about money, never wants something from you. He wants something for you. Because what he's really trying to do when he talks about money and resources and all those things is he's trying to help us find a way to make it so that we truly trust in him and not in our resources. And that we can line up our resources with what we value. You'll find peace in your life when you put your faith in what can outlast you, and it's not your money. And you'll also find peace in your life where the money that you spend echoes and reflects the values that you have. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. But the next point I want to lift up today is, what is an abundant life? What is an abundant life? The first thing I want to say is an abundant life is a simple life. 'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free, right? They were onto something. We often think that freedom comes with having a lot of things because then I don't have to stress out about things. But some of the freest people I've ever met are the simplest people. Some of the freest people you'll ever meet are the simplest people. How much money do you think Jesus had? I don't even know if he had a bank account. One time, someone came to him and they said, hey, we got to pay this tax. And of course, he was a cheater. He could just go and find gold in a fish's mouth. You know what I mean? But he didn't have to do what I have to do. And I got my tax bill from like the county. It's crazy here. But I know this. Jesus lived a simple life and yet somehow didn't feel like he was losing anything. He lived a simple life and yet didn't think that he was losing anything. This man in the text thought to himself, you know what? In order to have an abundant life, what I'm going to do is build more. My strategy towards security and toward abundance and towards life in its fullest, where I can eat, drink, and be merry, my strategy in order to get there is to just have more bigger barns. That's his goal. And Jesus looks at him and he says, you know what? Not only is your life going to be taken from you now, but you need to find a way to find abundant joy in the middle of things. It's not going to come in the future. You have to find it this very day. You know, there's that bumper sticker from way long ago that is silly. He who dies with the most toys wins, right? You might have seen that. Thankfully, I haven't seen one in many years. But there's this mentality that's always out there that says if I can just have enough stuff, if I can just have an unlimited credit card where I can buy whatever makes me feel happy, then I will finally find joy. Do you think that's true? You know, there's studies that have actually shown us that once you reach a certain income level, there's no amount after that that brings you more joy. Now, it's true that if you're on the poverty scale or you're at the lower income level or under-resourced in some way, yes, finances make a huge difference. Income can make a difference. But there's a point at which, once you have enough, getting more doesn't make you happier. And Jesus had a deep insight into this. He said, what you really want is to be able to have enough resources so that you can do what you want. And it's not to save up for the future. I've met folks in congregations I've served that were like this, where they grinded and grinded and grinded for the purpose of being able to retire and relax only to die way too early. And I hope that doesn't happen to anyone here. But one of the things that we find with this statement, an abundant life is a simple life, is the idea that in order to have joy, you don't need more. And that's counterintuitive, but I would argue, and I've experienced this for myself, that the times in my life that were often the most stressful and the most crazy is when I said yes to everything and felt like every night when I went to bed, I just needed to have more things in order to be happy. But you know how it works. The second you get it, what happens next? There's just one more thing. There's just one more thing. And the reason why is because our hearts were made that way. Your heart was made to want things. In other religious traditions, especially Buddhism, you're taught that in order to be happy, what you have to do is want nothing. Want nothing. If you could just go long enough and teach your heart never to want anything, then you'll find peace. But the actual reality that Christianity teaches is different. Is your heart was made to want things. It's okay to want things. In fact, there's no way you can stop yourself from wanting things. But if you want things like money to fill the deepest needs of your heart, it'll never work. The only thing that you could have and desire and want with all your heart that could ever fulfill those desires is God Himself. As the deer pants for water, so my soul longs for you, the Psalms say. You and I were made to want, but you just have to want the right things. This text also teaches us, and this is the third point, that money is not your own. Money is not your own. I love how the text says this. When the guy starts talking, he says, he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store up my surplus grain. And then I'll say to myself, do you hear the theme here? This man's life revolved around him. Everything was about I. Everything was about me. And when he received abundance, he viewed it not only as his own, but something to make him happy. That was kind of his approach to life. And what we find in this story is someone not only that dies too early and never gets anything, but if you live an extremely selfish life, you'll find that it's an isolated, lonely, and destructive one. And what we do here at Liberty is very different. I get to be, as a part of my role, a part of our session, which is our leadership team, and we have finance teams and other teams. And one of the things that we do is we pass budgets every year, and money comes to the church, and there's this moment where before and after every meeting, and all throughout the meeting, we're praying. And we're saying, God, this money that has come to Liberty is not Liberty's money. We always say that, and we mean it. It's not Liberty's money. Instead, what it is it's yours, and yet you've given it to us, and our role is to think about how we could use it in a way that honors you. And so every dollar that comes to Liberty, what happens is teams of people get together, and they think to themselves, all right, is the best use here or here? Here or here? And above all, God, we only want to do what's your will. And here's my challenge to you today, is that's how the church thinks about it. But that's also how you should think about it. You know, money, I've heard, is like water. It comes to us and then it flows out of us. We don't get to keep it after we die, and it just kind of flows around us all the time. We often feel like we can't hold on to it long enough, but we can direct it in different ways. Every single one of you has the responsibility and privilege given to you by God to steward and to direct the resources that you have. And you get to decide where it goes. You know, one of the things that Jen and I do, and we don't do it well enough, is we receive money from our work and from other things, and then we have to decide, all right, God, just like the church does, how can we honor you with this money that we've been given? What we don't do is we say, this is ours for our pleasure, to do our thing, to do what we want. Anytime we're given something, it's a gift from God to be used for God's purposes. And yes, sometimes that means taking your kids to the Paw Patrol movie, and that's okay. And yes, sometimes that means going on a vacation. And yes, sometimes that means doing all kinds of different wonderful things. You should know that in this text and in all the other texts that Jesus preaches, he never says money is bad. He says it can be the root of all evil, but it's not evil itself. It's a tool that God's given you to build his kingdom and to do his will. And that's a powerful thing that you've been given. Your money is not your own ultimately at the end of the day. The last point I want to make that this text tells us is that we are supposed to be rich toward God. Rich toward God. The story says, God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you, and then who will get what you've prepared for yourself? And this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. And I'll end by asking the question, what does it mean to be rich toward God? That's kind of an interesting phrase, and I'm not really sure what it means. Does it mean you give more, give less? I don't know. But I remember I was in a room with a bunch of folks one time, and one person said, man, I've made such a fortune during COVID. You know, the stocks went up, and of course this was like 6 months ago. They don't say that anymore. But you know, we made all this money during COVID, and the stocks went up, but we can't go do anything. I can't travel, I can't go anywhere, plus I'm getting old, and it's all really hard for me, but we made all this money in the market, and now I don't know what to do. And if you ask yourself that question, that's a sign that you never really viewed it as God's to begin with, and that God has given you an opportunity to be rich toward him. We'll talk more about this in the next week, but here's the vision I'd like to lay out, is that if we view ourselves as being rich toward God kinds of people, rich toward God's kind of people, what that doesn't mean is that I look rich, it means that he does. So I'm going to invest my resources and my time and my energy in what God values and in things that will outlast me. I'm going to invest my time and my energy in what God values and what outlasts me. What we're not going to do, this is very awkward here at Liberty because now we take up an offering. I wish the offering was before, because we don't want it to be about that. In fact, I'm actually not really sure that version of offering is the best, because giving shouldn't necessarily be emotional response. It should be something that's intentional and decided in advance. But here's what I know, is one of the ways that I am a wholehearted follower of Jesus is when I view all the things that God's given to me, my abundance, not as my own, but as things that I can use to be a blessing to other people. And when you do that, you find joy, and that's my hope and my prayer for you. Let us pray. God, we give you thanks for this opportunity to reflect on this text. We ask that you would help us discover and know the freedom that comes in resisting the temptation to just have more. Help us to be generous people. Help us to be people that are investing in the future, not ours, but yours. Help us to be the kind of people that have our eyes and ears attentive to the needs of those around us. So that on our tombstones it doesn't say he built a lot of barns, but it says he was generous and he loved greatly and he was rich toward God. May that be our story and our church's story, we pray in Jesus' name.